So, hello everybody. My name is Naomi Carson and I'm a doctor and I am a pathologist and I am a soft tissue pathologist. And by the time you've got to the end of those specialties, I'm one of only about 55, 60 people in the country who can really use all of the names of the tumours that you've been given with confidence and really know what they mean. So we're very rare, and if you have a bone sarcoma, there's probably even less, 20, 30 pathologists in the country who can diagnose your tumour. So that already puts us back into that rarity, that difficult area for any disease. This is a sarcoma, and this is how we diagnose them, by looking at them with light shining through them. We're going to talk about why this is so difficult and why this is different when it comes to the diagnostic pathway. Once you've already waited all that time, why then still, once you've had that core biopsy or that excision, why it's still difficult and more difficult than, say, having prostate or breast cancer to get that diagnosis. I don't get out a lot talking to patients. We are not patient-facing, so thank you for having me. The main issue that we're going to talk about today are the problems. So if you have not had a problem with your diagnosis and your core biopsy and it all went smoothly and quickly, fantastic. This talk is for the people where that didn't happen. This is a behind the scenes talk, and hopefully it'll be useful to understand that, because that's a really difficult position for you guys to be in. Pathologists, in order to understand why it's difficult to do sarcoma pathology, you need to understand how cancers are diagnosed in general. And we look at them. When things go to a lab, you assume it's going to be something like, like a full blood count, that it's going to be a machine that's going to show you, it's 13.1, and I just do these things, and it's certain. And that's not how it works. We look at what they look like, and we're trained to recognise them and put them into categories. And that sounds a little bit uncertain when you say it out loud. So I've got an analogy here, and don't worry, that's the last of the actual tumours. So we can see here that we've got two creatures, and this is what I'm doing. I'm putting biological entities into boxes. And this is what you're doing, and you've looked at them, and your brain has already gone, I know what those creatures are. You don't need to test them further. You don't need to do their genome. But in fact, if an alien landed in the car park outside and we brought them in, and we sort of explain, no, these are two very different animals. And it would go, why? And you go, that one's bigger than, no, wait a minute, that one's brown. No, that one's got 4 legs. They've both got ears. The ears are sticking out, no, that's not useful. You'd start talking about things about the shape of the muzzle. And the alien would be like, I'm not sure, they're different. You're going to need to do some further testing. But this is what's happening. When you get a pathology report back and they've just looked at it and they've gone, that's what it is, that's what we're doing. And the reason we're able to do that is because, like you've seen a lot of cats and dogs, we've seen a lot of those tumours. The problem with sarcoma is that no one's seen a lot of the tumours because there aren't a lot of them. And they don't tend to look characteristic. Yeah. So, this, is it a cat or a dog? Or other. If you saw it on a lead in a park, right, you go, that person's got an unusual dog. I'm going to ask them about their unusual dog. Context is very important for us to diagnose in. But in fact, if you saw it crawling through the forests of Madagascar, where this creature, which apparently is called a fusa, lives, then you'd go, it's something unusual. I will need to genomically test it, check its behaviour, look at it in context before I can categorise it. This is where sarcoma pathology sits. We have to do more work. We have to take more care. This is the wild. So if you have a prostate cancer, they're going to look at it and they're going to sign that report out 5 to 7 days later. That is not often the case with these types of tumours. Even if it looks quite characteristic, quite a lot of them can pretend to be different tumours. So we test them more. We test what markers are on those cells. And then we want to be beyond reproach. If we think that we can back it up with molecular testing, in our unit we do. So it takes extra time. And I'm sure many of you have experienced that. The molecular testing taking 2-3 extra weeks. You guys don't need to be told about how difficult it is to have rare diagnoses. If we can't build that pattern recognition as pathologists, it means we have to do every tumour from a sort of problem-solving analytical viewpoint. And that builds in time, and it's very difficult, and it's a difficult thing for pathologists as well. The prostate has cancer, one type of cancer, and not cancer. That's very easy diagnostic environment to live in. 122 and more different entities, not including the ones in the literature which we're diagnosing regularly that aren't even in the book yet, is a lot to deal with. And they all have, say, 5 different ways of looking. So then you're dealing, and those ways of looking overlap. So you're dealing with 500 different images that overlap with each other. So the level of complexity for diagnosis is really at the very edge of what the specialty can provide for accuracy. And then we get core biopsies. So if you think about those tumours all looking different and how complicated that is, and then we get a teeny weeny core biopsy bit of the tumour. And then we try and work it up off of that. And I'm always surprised at how well that often goes. But for example, you have a little core biopsy here. This is not a tumour. And you're thinking to yourself, what is that? So you go, oh, I think that's baked beans. And I think that tumour will therefore look like that. And I go to the MDT and I say, I think it's a tumour that looks like that. That's what I got in the core biopsy. Okay, well, we'll manage it like that. So then you get the tumour out and you sample it more thoroughly. And in fact, the core biopsy has missed the major issue there, which is this unusual person eating toast in a bath of baked beans. And what I'm trying to get over with this analogy is that when you take a tiny biopsy from a tumour, the tumours are not the same all over. So I'm sure some of you have had this experience of having a core biopsy diagnosis that says one thing, and then when the tumour's taken out, pathologist samples lots and lots of areas, and then they go, oh, actually, it's a grade 3. Or actually, now I've got some other evidence here, and it's now this other thing. And this is trying to explain why that happens, because you're only sampling a little bit, and you might be missing the more obvious and pertinent findings that are going to get you a more accurate diagnosis. It isn't finished yet. So even amongst all of those different tumours and their different ways of appearing, there's also this black box of things yet to be described. So some people are left in this situation of after all this testing, you're waiting for the molecular, you've waited for a second national opinion. After all that testing, you are still not given a concrete diagnosis. And that's because either the tumour is not showing its hand and is just too difficult to categorise, or it's a tumour that will be described, say, in 5 years' time, but hasn't got a good diagnostic description yet, which is a very difficult place for people to live. Unlike, and when you're in that uncertain situation, unlike carcinomas, so say colorectal carcinoma, breast carcinomas, sarcomas, we can't step back to first principles like we can for the breast and say, well, I can tell you first off, I don't know what exactly to call it, but it is a malignant tumour, or it is a benign tumour. And you're like, well, the minutiae don't matter, that's the important distinction, right? For sarcoma, how it looks on the slide doesn't allow us to make that confident distinction, which is another real problem. So there is going to be, for a small minority of tumours, uncertainty still there, which again is difficult for the pathologist to hold, because people like me go into pathology to solve a tumour, to analytically work out what's going on. And we don't like to hold that uncertainty ourselves. The MDT, it's a very challenging thing to manage there. And as a patient, holding that uncertainty day to day, I'm sure some of you will have that experience, is deeply uncomfortable. Some of you might have experienced misdiagnosis early on in your pathway. We get referral work in. That's not uncommon, because if you think probabilistically, statistically, no one would ever diagnose a sarcoma, because it's always probably more likely to be a carcinoma, a melanoma, a lymphoma even. So the fact there's only 3 of us in region who report these mean that in all the other hospitals, they don't even know about all these appearances of the sarcomas. So it's not uncommon that they put into their box an unusual variant of their thing, and you're given a diagnosis that is going to be changed later down the line. That's not unusual because of the rarity and the difficulty. And then lastly, there aren't enough pathologists. So, pathology is having a workforce crisis. Quite a lot of soft tissue pathology posts are unfilled. And again, it's a rarity issue. So if you make doing the most amount of cancer cases your target, if you have a specialty that's only got a low number of cases, it's not going to get prioritised when you're recruiting to fill gaps in your workforce. So it's difficult to get a higher management structure to think about prioritising that when it's recruiting people. And it takes a lot of time to train up in this area. So last slide. So if you're someone who wanted to look at their pathology report and you got hold of it, tips for reading the pathology report: start at the bottom and then work up. So the pathologist starts with a description of the tumour, so that's going to be least relevant to you. What that's for is for the other pathologists. These are the evidence points I've noted about this tumour. This is what I've drawn on to make my diagnosis at the bottom. So if you start at the bottom, it's going to tell you the diagnosis, and you can read up, and it'll become less and less relevant or understandable. Pay attention to phrases like "in keeping with" and "favours" and "suggestive of." It sounds sort of just like it's a bit verbose, a bit of filler. But in those situations, pathologists are pulling back slightly from a very firm diagnosis. That doesn't mean that the diagnosis is wrong. It just means that we are gently sharing some responsibility with the rest of the MDT team. So you're like, oh, it favours this. But if you then tell me that people don't tell us a lot of information on our forms, for example, that they have a hereditary cancer syndrome, or in fact, they have a whole history of something else, or you said it's in this location, it's actually in another location, that could change everything. So that's us sharing that responsibility, and that's why we had the MDT meetings. So that, I think, wraps it up for me. Thank you.